Michael is the keeper of living collections over at the Arnold Arboretum for the past 10 years or so. He comes by way of a undergraduate degree at Indiana at Purdue University in Public Horticulture and Gardens. He did a master's degree at Iowa State in ecophysiology, and then was a fellow at the Arnold Arboretum for a year or two in the early 2000s. And then went on to Cornell University to do a PhD with Tom Whitman in plant sciences, plant biology?
Yeah.
Plant biology. Where I actually met him out there. We both started the same year in graduate school out there, so we had classes together and overlapped quite a bit. And then after finishing his PhD, he came back to the Arnold Arboretum, where he took on the role of the curator of living collections, which was recently updated to be called the keeper of living collections. He's been at the helm as they've sort of reinvigorated their plant collecting and plant exploration trips around the world. There's a sort of a new initiative that he'll be telling us about tonight. And so it's sort of an exciting time to hear from Michael about what the Arboretum is up to, what their goals are for preserving and protecting plant diversity, and then also touching on the issue of sort of whether or not plant exploration has a place, whether it's dead in a plant-blind era. Sort of excited to hear from Michael tonight.
Great. Well, thank you, Jesse. And it's fantastic to be back here at NEBC. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago I was last here and talking about chasing red needles in green haystacks, a conservation project I was still involved with on the conservation of a rare tree from China. Now we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit. And instead of focusing on just one rare plant, lots of rare plants, but kind of what does that mean in the context of botanical gardens and arboretum around the world, more specifically the Arnold Arboretum. But they kind of nest that within this context, and I'm speaking to the choir. Actually, I'm probably speaking to other preachers here. So, you know, plant blindness, nature deficit disorder, and things like that. So I want to kind of roll it all in one and see how we do. Is there a way we can just put the front lights off? Oh, sorry, I don't want to jump to. We'll have plenty of questions later on the end. I know some people need to get back up to Maine or New Hampshire or Ottawa or wherever people travel from. So if I promise to keep it in time, but we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. Oftentimes I start to talk and we all get excited about just plant diversity. It's why we're all here, whether we're excited about, the beautiful, oops, that's my pencil, that's not gonna, doesn't matter. Whether they're beautiful, backlit hydrangeas, or metasequoias in the snow, tall, gymnocladus, one of my favorite leguminous trees, the Kentucky coffee tree. Who can't love, awesome, thanks. Who doesn't love the harlequin-like flowers of a catalpa? And then, of course, I had to put a paperbark maple slide in there. Plants are beautiful. We know that. That's why we're here. We're celebrating that. We also know that it's tough. 2 years ago, Kew, in their State of the World's Plants, issued this proclamation that 1 out of 5 of Earth's plant species are threatened with extinction. Pretty sobering news. And it's tough, and that's at a global scale. They took into account certainly the plants that we know to exist, but they also did some, I wouldn't even say back of the envelope, they did some rather precise calculations to estimate the number of species that are yet to be described and the areas where they might be and the threats to the environmental challenges in those environments. So it's tough at a global scale. We also know, thinking more specifically, is a project I was involved in a couple of years ago with the U.S. Botanic Garden and BGCI. At the time, there wasn't even a comprehensive list of how many plants are threatened native to North America, all 3 countries, including the Caribbean, and also which ones were threatened. And then we wanted to more specifically dial in to see how many of those, in case their in situ environments were compromised, how many of them were backed up in some way, shape, or form in a seed or a clonal germplasm repository. We found that there were about 9,500 threatened North American plant species, 1 out of 3 that were threatened in some way, shape, or form. And there were only about 40 at the time. that were backed up in some capacity. We've resampled more recently and we've made some improvements, but this is all towards the global strategy for plant conservation. And so botanical gardens have been thinking about these issues for a little while, about plant conservation. And then global change comes in all forms. And what about that climate thing? These are just local data that I pulled from our weather station. Actually, 3 different weather stations at the Arnold Arboretum going back 50 years. This is just tracking one thing and one thing only, which is the primary determinant of what survives here in Boston. If any of you are gardeners, you know that the annual minimum temperature is a major factor. We do know that there's an upward trend, that our minimum temperatures are getting warmer each year. But oddly enough, 3 years ago, we had our coldest winter in over 60 years. So it's not only getting warmer at a trend each year, but then it's getting more, there's more heterogeneity. Dump that onto invasive non-native organisms like my friend the emerald ash borer, a beautiful thing. Dorothy and the others at the beautiful land of Oz would probably celebrate it, but our native ashes are not. I snapped this picture just about 3 months ago on my way back from my folks' home in Indiana. Just right on the highway. Everybody wonders what they knew. You probably have done this too. You stopped and taken pictures, or voucher to plant on the side of the road. You get lots of ways, but anyway, just all along Pennsylvania and New York, the number of ash trees that are now gone. This is just from last month, the current map. EAB arrived here in 2000. And this is where it's the extent of it. Billions of ash trees haven't just been threatened, but they're compromised. They're gone. It's a challenge. This paper just came out in Frontiers, kind of looking at the interaction between climate change, aspects of problems with the land, and then mortality that's derived by the interaction of that and maybe insects or pests and diseases. I mean, to sum it up, it isn't easy being green. Kermit was right. It's tough. It's really tough. And again, I'm preaching to the choir about how dire it might be out there. Nobody in this room suffers from this, but we probably all heard about it. The Last Child in the Woods, a book came out, 10, 15 years ago now. Richard Louv coining the term nature deficit disorder. And what he pinpointed is the issue with children in particular, where they've lost contact with the outdoors, with nature, with science in that sense. Free play, a whole host of different things. But describe the human costs of actually being alienated from the natural world. Without getting too philosophical and digging into Karl Marx, but alienation was something where he talked about it being an estrangement from what make us humans. The human species essence is what he coined. But I think that we have, as a society, as there are fewer people that are connected to agriculture or rural areas, where we may not be gardening as much as we used to, we've kind of lost that. We've become alienated from plants. Although things are changing, slow food movements, people wondering where their food comes from, maybe wanting to grow, even if it's not everything, a single tomato on their patio. So, it's not all bad in the world. But I think we have, as a global society, become alienated from plants. When we think about that, one thing, and I mentioned this in my title of the talk, is about plant blindness. Plant blindness was a syndrome that was coined almost 20 years ago from some professors at, I think Tulane, or LSU, in Louisiana. But they said it's the inability to see or notice plants in their own environment. And that people don't see plants, then they don't recognize the importance of those plants. They may not recognize how charming or beautiful they are. And they consistently will rank plants inferior to animals. There are even a fascinating set of studies where they'd have this, maybe some of you have seen it, a photograph or a painting of a jungle scene. And there's all these, probably 50 different species, cartoon species, but species of plants, and there's one jaguar in the tree. And they say, what do you see? And everybody's like, oh, it's a jaguar, it's a jaguar. One jaguar relative to 50 species of plants. And guess what everybody pointed to? There was a recent paper a couple of years ago where they're in conservation biology where they were linking to the fact that plant blindness is probably a contributor to why animal conservation is further ahead than plant conservation. Again, it's, the two are inextricably linked. I mean, we're all guilty of this. I mean, I'm in Shenandoah a couple of years ago, and I've got, you know, Rhinopithecus, wild monkeys, and I mean, we were both taking the selfie. I don't know who was, actually the monkey there I think was on my back. We all had monkeys on our back, right? I had a monkey on my back pressing on, you know, I was actually looking probably for food. But I am also those who take, I do take plant selfies. And sometimes you get a group of other botanists, and this is the biggest acergrissum we'd ever seen in our life. We all took it. How many of you have taken a plant selfie? Come on, admit it. Okay, a few. Well, that's good. Again, you know, I do think there are things that are linked there. But you can't just be doom and gloom. I'm very much a pragmatist. I'm a realist, but I'm a pragmatist, and I've always been an optimist. And I think about what role I play directly and what role I play indirectly as a plant explorer, as a botanist, as a horticulturist, somebody who works a lot with international botanical gardens, is thinking about what can we do from here. And in particular, what roles and past and present does plant exploration play? You know, small little vignette into history, you know, going back, you know, botanical gardens have, you know, been at the forefront of plant exploration for millennia. Informally, formally centuries. You think about the Royal Botanical Garden, Edinburgh, from the 17th century. A lot of, you know, whether they're Meganopsis or Cercidophyllum or an array of different Ericaceae, in that case a whole bunch of different rhododendron molly, you know, collected directly from the wild. You can always think about they're younger. They don't like, you know, Kew doesn't like it when you say this, but Kew is younger than Edinburgh. Kew certainly, when you think about the Victorian era of botanical gardens and museums and collecting curiosities. You know, the Arnold Arboretum was founded in 1872, much younger than those other two, and much younger than a lot of other gardens. Missouri Botanical Garden, 25 years older than the Arnold. You know, founded then, and kind of that toggling between that old Victorian perspective, but then also new ways of approaching science, new ways of approaching museums. And I use that analogy an awful lot because all botanical gardens are museums. Sometimes they don't realize it. Sometimes museums don't realize that botanical gardens are also museums. You guys know this place? Maybe some of you have been there in Paris, the Louvre. Probably the quintessential museum out there, full of a lot of stuff. We know this thing, this plant. I'm sorry, this plant. Sorry, this painting. Painting has a great deal of value, in part because of, I guess, the beauty, the ability, you know, to the artistic value. That it's really, we know who painted it. We know the backstory. We know all that history. And when I think about what make museum collections valuable, whether it's those that are in this building and the herbaria next door, you know, it's really the value of those specimens and the backstory that make them value. So when I think about the Arnold Arboretum, you know, all images just from last year at different seasons, understanding the value of this large exhibit, this museum with all these different exhibit wings of the Arboretum that comprise all of these individual pieces of art. Whether it's an odd mutant of our native Hamamelis virginiana that happens to produce pinkish flowers. It's found naturally in Connecticut. Whether there are some of our natural and non-native violets, crazy weeping Cercidophyllum, golden hops. They don't make the best beer, trust me. Our own introductions of syringas, or even some beautiful golden larches. All of these individual plants have certain stories attached to them and their value. You know, we have roughly 17 or 16,000 plants in the ground as a snapshot of the botanical diversity. For a temperate woody plant collection, it's very high in diversity. And those are expressed as dots on the map. These are just the rhododendrons that are in our collections. You know, each and every one of those dots, if you were to hover over with your mouse or with even on your phone, you could do it. You could hit the dot and bring up all the information. You could navigate, turn the GPS on your phone, and navigate from plant to plant. You know, sharing those stories. But that backstory is where it all begins. it's really what we're all about. You know, in the NEBC collection, you've got a treasure trove of specimens representing plants ubiquitous and common to rare to extirpated. And all of those carry with each one of those vouchers has a certain story. So you know what I'm talking about. Here we have C.S. Sargent, our founding director, sitting in the library at the Arboretum, probably in the 19-teens in this image. He's looking over a Quercus voucher, hadn't even mounted yet. And I use that analogy about, again, the book analogy. You know, with museum specimens, particularly with those that are living, you know, each is like a book. You know, it has a spine, has a title, has maybe a Dewey Decimal or some other, you know, system of cataloging, a la an accession number. It has the information about, you know, where that plant came from, those basic primary documentation and data. But the beautiful thing is that once they get there, we accumulate more stories through research for telling new stories. And one of the things that we do is we arm each and every one of our staff, our visiting scholars. We don't just share with them the stories of the past, but those books are open for them to write new stories. And it's really, it's something that museums have been very conscious of. It's not just preserving the stuff and the objects, but it's ensuring that you're sharing them, sharing the information, and sharing the ability to derive new knowledge from them. When we put that in the context of, and these are just old accession details from, you know, 100 years ago, old accession cards, old accession books, a cartoon of just how we were trying to track where this one went. Sometimes you have to be Sherlock Holmes to go through some of these 125-year-old lineages where they didn't necessarily pay as close attention to you know, keeping the numbers straight as we do now. But thinking about that, you know, we think about plant exploration and some of those old stories, and we might think of Joseph Rock and this picture from the 1920s in Tibetan dress. In Tibet or maybe in Gansu province. You can think of Wilson, a photo that he took of his team in Sichuan in 1908. You know, these beautiful glory days of exploration. You know, Wilson himself, before he even joined the staff of the Arnold Arboretum, this is Wilson here standing next to C.S. Sargent. He had 2 trips under his belt when he worked for a Veitch nursery firm to China, 2 more trips to China under the Arboretum's dime as an employee. Subsequent trip to Japan, and then Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. He did further exploration after the fact, but not as much from the most of it was here. And you know, he was going around the world. His first trip took him to China to go after one thing and one thing only, and that was the dove tree. Not very charismatic in this image that he took, but this is what the dove tree, Davidia involucrata, looks like in bloom. These I took a few years ago in Ya'an, one of the populations that Wilson had visited in western Sichuan. A cluster of male flowers with 1 lone female flower, and then subtended by these 2 large bracts. Drop dead gorgeous and ethereal, and you can see why Veitch Nursery sent him to go after just this one plant, to bring it into cultivation for, you know, at that time derive, you know, to derive pleasure in the horticultural garden. But Wilson also found other things. I mean, he said his favorite maple, or the who pays best maple, he wrote in his near illegible scrawl in his collecting notebook, was Acer spa. He didn't quite know which it was at the time. And you know, beautiful trees that were growing at the edge of cliffs. And here's one a seedling actually that Wilson had brought back in 1907, still growing at the Arnold Arboretum with the celebrated beautiful cinnamon peeling bark. You know, these plants were brought back, and they weren't there just for pleasure, although people certainly derived a lot of that. They were there for scholarship. I mean, here we had this dream team. You had Wilson here. On his right was Alfred Rader, the taxonomist. You had at the helm C.S. Sargent. You had one of my unsung heroes, Charles Edward Faxon, who's a botanical illustrator who Professor Jack said he was actually probably a better botanist than Sargent, because Faxon saw and drew the details that Sargent then needed in order to figure out how to identify a lot of these hickories and a lot of these oaks. And then you had Camilo Schneider, who at the time was kind of going back and forth from Germany to the U.S. Anyway, you had this group all together looking at these plants that Wilson and others were bringing back, putting together multi-volume books like Plantae Wilsoniae with you know, an enumeration of the plants that Wilson had brought back, 3 separate volumes from China in just a short period of time. New species descriptions, range expansions, new descriptions on older species. Anyway, it was the heyday in many ways of alpha taxonomy. But there was another value. When Sargent was in Japan in 1892, he collected a Japanese species of hydrangea. Thought it had already been in cultivation, didn't think it was really that special. They brought it back and noticed that it flowered 6 weeks before any others. Precocious, and so you Latinize precocious and you call it praecox. But it was an interesting ecotype, in part because of its latitude. It was one to flower earlier. And those are these are from 1892, still growing in now our rose garden. A little out of place, but it used to be the shrub and vine garden. You know, how many of you are gardeners? How many of you practice zone denial? You know, like, oh, I know I'm zone 5, but I'm going to try to grow this zone 7 plant. We all do it. Sargent did it. He was hell-bent to get cedar of Lebanon to grow. It always failed, but when they learned that there were some in Turkey, he complained about it. He spent a lot of money hiring a German engineer named Walter Zea, who was working in Turkey to go and collect several kilos of cones. And they, lo and behold, they're hardy to minus 36 C, which is about the same thing as minus 36 F. And so sometimes the drivers of exploration was to bring back and collect new ecotypes that you could grow in New England. And of course, conservation became important in the mid part of the 20th century. Obviously now it's a primary driver. But we can go back to Metasequoia, 1947, when the Arnold Arboretum helped fund an expedition in the midst of the Civil War in China, following the coattails of World War II, to collect herbarium vouchers and germplasm of Metasequoia. So very much with conservation in mind. If I sum up kind of looking back, what plant exploration in the past was, a lot of it was discovering. Obviously, the plants were there. They didn't need discovery. But discovering and introducing these new plants, focus on alpha diversity, certainly a focus on economic value or economic botany. You could think of some colonial, nations with colonial pasts. You could think of the UK in particular. You could think of Kew Gardens, very much involved in economic botany, particularly in the tropics. But that also extends to new ornamentals. We know that the world's changed. We talked about that earlier on. One thing we didn't really talk about, we talked about EAB, but we didn't necessarily talk about plants that are naughty. I highlight this about our friend, the Japanese barberry. This is what C.S. Sargent wrote in Garden and Forest, and a publication for about a decade that he edited. And 1889, he writes, the bold's mine. But he says, I has much to recommend at hardiness, free and rapid growth, showy and persistent fruit. Few shrubs are better suited to form low masses of foliage or for dwarf hedges. He was making these types of recommendations, even though it had already been introduced 80 years before. But so says the Arnold Arboretum director, it must have value. At the same time, you have nurseries down in Plymouth, Massachusetts, growing these things by the tens of 20s of thousands. So, crazy. Of course, our own state and local and federal governments were advocating growing barberry for soil erosion control as well as for wildlife habitat post Silent Spring. This was recommended 100 years later, but it's interesting. We have what I call one of the original sins of botanical gardens. So these are the plants that do too well. We've already talked a little bit about the plants that don't do well enough. Franklinia alatamaha, extinct in the wild, last seen in 1803. Preserved because it was collected and brought into cultivation. Things on the brink. Rhododendron basii, a plant native to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Beautiful, drop-dead gorgeous azalea. The Arnold Arboretum holds the national collection of this as part of the Center for Plant Conservation. And it's really part of our mission is to not just preserve the plants, but once you preserve them, you've got to encourage more studies or more stories to be told about those plants, so the conservation value. which rolls into something that gardens do. We explore in order to not just gather the data, but then use those data, synthesize those data to generate new knowledge. Transforming data into knowledge is something that we all should be eager to do. It helps when you're trying to do things to improve society. Something near and dear to my background academically is, it's tough. Life on the street's tough. Most street trees fail, usually because of the built environment is poor, but also very few trees, if any, ever evolved under these circumstances. There are very few things that are pre-adapted to grow there. You cannot find something, that evolved in Boston 3,000 years ago that would grow, on Comm Ave or Beacon Street or wherever. So I think, if we have a goal to increase urban tree canopy, then we're going to have to figure out how to do it. And I think, plant exploration plays a role in thinking about appropriate new garden plants. Appropriate meaning those that are not naughty, they're not going to invade, those are going to be well behaved, but are still going to, add value to our lives. And another driver about why does the Arnold Arboretum and other botanical gardens, why do we still collect? Well, we're dynamic collections. As I was mentioning to Jesse on the way over, a botanical garden collection, it's not like a bunch of drawers full of a bunch of rocks. All due respect to this building. These things are dynamic. They grow. They grow, they thrive. Sometimes they fail to grow and thrive. Things are always challenging and changing. And so, there are additions and subtractions. We have subtractions all the time. Those subtractions trigger addition. And that is actually an asset, not necessarily a detriment to the botanical garden way of life. So a little bit of contrasting what I said happened in the Halison days, quote unquote. I think not just on behalf of the Arnold Arboretum, but other places that presently, gardens are collecting responsibly. We have learned, for the most part, of the sins of the past. The focus is on plant biodiversity. And really it's in response to all these changes in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's habitat destruction. And really it boils down, for the most part, into these 5 things. Gardens are collecting to document, to conserve, to study or research, to grow and then share. Share the plants, but also share the knowledge. I think one of the things I do a lot at the Arboretum, I'm thinking about how do we improve our practices for plant collecting. And, we put up manuals. In fact, it's called the Expedition Toolkit that a lot of botanical gardens now use on how do they embark on a plant collecting trip, all the way from how do you start to plan to one, all the way to, how do you decide what to collect on that first day out? How do you know if this is the plant you should collect? And so we've, harmonized a lot of different past experiences of different successful collectors to help out those who might not have the experience but have the gumption to go out and collect. And it boils down into successful explorations. You don't usually wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm going to go off to China. Usually they're well planned, well in advance. It's rare that we have broad, general baling hay types of trips, a la Wilson. Wilson was there a year or 2 at a time. Usually they're focused with a very specifically derived list of desiderata, things you want. We're collaborative. That's not just multiple institutions maybe working in country or out of country, but also with locals. One of my collecting trips down to the Ozarks, we were working very well with Natural Heritage down there. Theo Witzel, some of you might know, one of the best field botanists I've ever met. Hand in hand, thinking about some of the rare plants of the Ouachita and the Ozarks. So the collaboration is really important. Certainly documentation is important, because if you bring the plant without we curate associations of objects and their value, their information. If you don't have the information, the plant doesn't have the value. And the other thing is that, the long-term commitment. A lot of, there are nurseries out there who are collecting in the wild, legally. Nothing wrong with that. But it's a commercial value. There's a commercial interest, and there's not a long-term commitment to maintain anything, whether it's the information or the germplasm. Botanical gardens, we have a 1,000-year lease on the property, barring zombies or apocalypse or something like that, these plants are going to stay in perpetuity. As Jesse alluded, a couple years ago we launched a campaign for the Living Collections, which was to jumpstart, invigorate plant collecting at the Arboretum. Prior to this launch, I was doing 1 a year, maybe 2. Now we've got 4 or 5 a year. Everybody's involved. And it's been a good rallying point for the Arboretum in a way to simultaneously recognize and preserve our past, but really looking 100 years into the future. Just like Wilson was collecting 100 years ago and his contemporaries, and we're still celebrating those successes. What is it that we can do now, taking into account climate change, taking into account conservation, our core collections, so that we can really secure our future and be thoughtful about it. There's a whole bunch of different articles that were written about, from the planning to how do you go out and collect. They're all in Arnoldia. Arnoldia, 107 years, are online for free. You can query those. But this 10-year campaign started in 2015, and we identified just a mere 400 taxa around the world that we feel are singular in their value to add. These are hot off the press. This like 3 p.m. today. Kyle Port, our magical manager of plant records, who's better at GIS than I am. We just dropped these in based on our 4 expeditions this year. The red dots are showing things that in the past 3 years that the Arnold Arboretum's collected on expedition. We just had an expedition, 3 years ago we had an expedition here in Idaho. This year we had an expedition that hit a little further west in the Pacific Northwest. We've had 3 expeditions in the Ozarks and the Ouachitas, etc. It's essential, that we're out there collecting, but we also have collaborators around the country here who are also helping us to collect, and that's where all these kind of teal colors are coming from. Friends, others from other germplasm repositories, botanical gardens, local naturalists who are helping us, just like 100 years ago, Sargent strong-armed people, and I've got the letters to prove it. He strong-armed people to go and collect and send things to the Arboretum. We're not strong-arming, we're sharing in the success, but collecting high-value things. That extends to Asia. Again, the reds are expeditions that we've been on the past few years. I had 3 of them just right in here. This year we just had a trip back to Shenanjia. The last time the Arnold had been there was the pivotal 1980 Sino-American Botanical Expedition. We just came back this year. And then just a month ago I was in Japan collecting mostly in the Nikko, but a couple spots in Chichibu and Wakayama. So yeah, we're aggressive in going out to collect. I figured I'd share a few stories just quickly on just last year's trip. For the most part, people tend to enjoy what's it like when you're botanizing someplace. So our 2017 NACPET trip, what the heck is NACPET? That is the North America China Plant Exploration Consortium. Everything's got to have an acronym. But anyway, this is a consortium of about 10 North American botanical gardens in collaboration with other gardens, primarily the Beijing Botanical Garden, to study the flora of China. And since 1993, there have been 16, actually 17 now. This map is out of date, doesn't include 2018's. But these green dots are all the different places where our collaboration has been collecting. Last year we were here. This year we were here. I need to add a 17 on that. But anyway, that's where we were in central northern Sichuan. Our group, anybody know John Shaw? John Shaw is the managing editor of Harvard Magazine. But also, does anybody know John Shaw, who actually used to be the director of New England Wildflower Society? That's his dad. Anyway, John came along for a couple days because we had a write-up about this in Harvard Magazine last winter. He profiled the trip. We had Gao Jinfen, who's a curator and professor of botany at the Chengdu Institute of Biology. One of her graduate students came along to Mr. Li, Liu Cheng, and to get some field experience. He was kind of a lab botanist. And it was good for us to get him out in the field. It was great. Myself, our manager of horticulture, Andrew Kopinski, Yin Kai-pu, who's a retired professor from the same department, who's done a lot of rephotography of Wilson's pictures. And then Wang Kang is kind of second in command, so to speak, at Beijing Botanical Garden, and one of the members of his curatorial staff, Jin. And so this was our team. Yin and Gao did not. They were there for a little bit, but this is kind of the launch. But these are collaborative in nature, going after and studying plants of mutual interest, gathering a lot of material for Mr. Lee's master's work, anyway, yeah. You always got to stop and get lots of supplies, whether it's water, toilet paper, Pijo, beer, and heading out in the mountains. So we headed out of Chengdu, and Chengdu is in a very flat basin. You go about an hour and a half or 4.5 hours, depending on traffic, outside of Chengdu, and the mountains rise up to meet you. And then the roads give way. We had a lot of earthquakes about a month before, so it was the roads were rough, and then it hit monsoon season, and so the roads were washing out. Or sometimes mudslides would occur, and this semi got buried like an hour and a half beforehand. Just like well, you can see what happened. You got stuck. Sometimes you go to get gas and they're out of gas, so you got to pump your own. So this was pumping it out of here and filling it. So anyway, it's always an adventure. Keep going down the road. Eventually, you get to where you need to go. This small little village in the middle of a panda preserve, Zhaobading. And they had recently built about 10 years ago, kind of a ranger station, hostel, and we bunked up there. Great food, great camaraderie. Here's the guy who's running the station, and they had a nice ginkgo plant out of the front. I don't know what Kong, I just noticed that. I don't know what Kong's like, oh my God, something must have happened. Maybe I was driving the car and it hit something. This was a map that was up on the wall, and we came in down here. It's a large preserve, but the main thing, these little marks right there are all the different, relatively recent, over the last 10 years, panda sightings. So there's a lot of panda in the area. So you get out, and no different than those of us in this room, you kind of get out in nature. Maybe you don't have the topography quite like this, but you go out and hike, and we have local expertise. We were in this day, we're actually hiking up this ridge, which was, I try to be in shape for these. A lot of hand over hand climbing, but you get breaks in the trees, and you get to see just beautiful vegetation of China. Sometimes the climbing's tough, and sometimes you also get hit by leeches, a lot of leeches. So I know to bring my leech socks usually, which sometimes help. But then you start enjoying the flora, whether it's the beautiful Betula abelsinensis, or Anii abelsinensis, whatever your taxonomy, whether you want to buy into Hughes Betula monograph or not. Beautiful analog to river birch. In some respect, it's different ploidy, but it peels off in these beautiful pinkish salmon strips. Red jerseys, they're just the size of, you couldn't even put your hands around these spikes that were just monstrous. The flora is, China has 3 times the biodiversity of North America, despite being about the same size, from plant perspective. It helps when you're not glaciated as far, and you have a nice tropical refugia to your south to repopulate. But started making collections. One of them that was caught our eye last year is Fagus angleriana, which had only been introduced one time. And there's been very little research done on it, even in China. And what little has been done in the West is from one single lone collection that Wilson made in 1908. It makes you pause. It'd be like an alien coming down here and gathering one of us, or maybe one of your favorite politicians or movie stars, and saying, that is Homo sapiens. It's everything we know about it. So when I saw this, I was very giddy and excited. It's a beech tree that characteristically in the wild as well as in cultivation branches quite low. One thing I learned is that one of the common names they have, chicken claw beech, because it kind of has that multi-stemmed habit. But apparently these are preferred habitat for pandas. in the winter, they'll grab bamboo and kind of make a den, oftentimes in the crux of all of those branches. So, wow, what excitement! But to see something, to find it, to collect it, bring it, additional germplasm to cultivation. But then those stories about, wow, there's a touch of the panda there. Other fantastic things, Deutzias and Schizandras. Anyway, so you get the, we're working off lists of things that we're targeting. We are open to opportunistic collecting. Sometimes there's things that we're not targeting that you don't expect to find, and so you might also collect those. But a single collecting trip might only yield 60 or 70 collections over a 3-week period. We're pretty circumspect on what we collect. Sometimes you're doing roadside collecting. These are some Lilium regale, and pole pruners come in handy. Sometimes we're climbing. Sometimes we've got pole saws. Sometimes we've got pocket chainsaws. You name it. You're collecting the germplasm, seeds. Doing a cut test, make sure there's an actual embryo in there is always important. You never want to go through and go to all the trouble of collecting something and bringing it back and all your seeds are empty. So it's prudent to go through and do that. And you do, it's about 1 day collecting for every half day of then cleaning. A lot of cleaning and sorting and drying. You don't want your seeds to be wet and to rot. You want to obviously extract all your seeds from your pulpy fruits. And so everybody gets involved. The drivers, the graduate students, and others. It's a big thing. We still use old technology like winnowing. It works. It works. I'm not as good as Kong. He's very good at winnowing. So we're collecting the germplasm. But again, it's we're circumspect. Every single trip I've ever been on in China, I see Acer Davidii. It's ubiquitous, dripping with seed, and every tree. It's these trees that then turn into vines. You'll have 10 feet of growth on each branch. They're scanded. And it's interesting, you look at a lot of botanical gardens that go to China, and they've got tons of Acer Davidii. It's because they keep collecting it. We don't need any more. In fact, it's something I'm a little worried about. Could be a possible weed in the future. When I see something that's that common in, I don't care if it's Massachusetts or it's Sichuan, if I say that common and habitually producing that much seed, no thank you. Euonymus hamiltonianus really isn't in cultivation much. I know enough about the life history traits of Euonymus alatus to know that, this is not rare, it's not endangered, it's safeguarded. Now if we had a high priority Euonymus collection, where we're doing a lot of ecology and taxonomy work on Euonymus, we might make an exception and put it in captivity like an Ebola virus. But these are things that we just walk away from. We don't collect. Just say no, like Nancy Reagan would say. Mm-hmm. We still use paper. I know there are apps. I print these up on Right in the Rain paper, so it still works. And it still works even in torrential rain, whereas your handheld device doesn't work really well. So we put it in there. We have our we translate, like in this case, this is from China, so everything's in English and in Chinese. We did the same thing for in Japanese. We had a trip a couple years ago to the Republic of Georgia, everything in Georgian and Russian, because some of our botanists were Russian. And so, so you're gathering, the typical kind of details that you would put on a herbarium label. We voucher everything, usually a complete set for the herbaria here, one for the U.S. National Arboretum. We tend to send sets there. Other collaborators that are with us, and then always in-country herbaria. Sometimes that's at the national level, sometimes that's at a regional level. Depends on who we're working with. But it's really important that we're vouchering and photographing. The seed might not germinate, or they might germinate and they might not live. But these collections are value, and again, you guys know the value of a specimen. Oftentimes we're collecting, tea bags full of leaves for future molecular work. So we've always got some silica with us too. I go back and just, that's from a typical kind of a trip, like in China. Sometimes they are more focused on long-term seed storage. Just showing you the emerald ash borer map, and you can see this is from October, this is a month ago. pretty much all the northern tier of Pennsylvania, southern tier of New York have been hit by EIB. That's where all the baseball bats come from. Any World Series fans. They might be milled, the sluggers might be made down here, but they all come from there. And those forests are full of EAB right now. So a couple of years ago, we went and we collected about 25 different populations of 3 species, only a couple black ash, but mostly white and green, throughout that area, just at the cusp, right at the moving front of EAB, and we were collecting in those levels at the population level. So, you know, one population of maybe 15 maternal lines, a couple thousand seeds per maternal plant, mother plant, and those go into long-term seed storage. We don't do it at the Arnold. We collaborate with USDA, and so they're there for 50, 100 years in the future. So who knows, maybe EAB will equilibrate, maybe something will happen, but we'll be able to replant those populations in 50 or 100 years. Thankfully, because, well, the seeds actually do store. They're not like oak acorns and things. So that's kind of that's a special case. But back to China, we're oftentimes cleaning in our hotel rooms, drying. It's always very damp. So you've got the air conditioners running and sometimes herbarium dryers, and we're, you know, we usually try to save at least 4 or 5 days at the end, even though we're staying up to 1 o'clock at night or so cleaning. It's a marathon race to the end. Cleaning things up, sorting. The lights are always pretty low in China. So we always bring headlamps because you know, when you're looking at something really tiny, rhododendron seed, you know, hydrangea seed, forget it. You can never see that without a microscope. But you know, so bring your own lighting. Eventually, getting it all kind of boxed up, bagged up. When we're collecting, so we clean off, like this is Davidia right here, Davidia seed. It looks kind of like if you've never seen a Davidia fruit, it kind of looks like a rogue wild pear, kind of that meaty, pulpy type of consistency, unripe. You got to clean off all of the pulp off of that. We package them into small lots, and those we don't carry them. We send them directly to USDA APHIS, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, and everything gets inspected for pest, disease, anything. They will nutlets of these Tilia chinensis, wrong country, Tilia chinensis here. They'll run those right through a X-ray. This X-ray machine that's about the size of a 1978 version of a microwave, and they put it in there, and they can count. They can see each and every seed that might have a weevil in it. They'll pull it out. Good. Not on my watch. I do not want anything coming in under our watch that might harbor a pest or pathogen. So you know, that happens. We clean them all up. We get them in those bags. These are the bags where they get shipped off. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, lo and behold, they're back at the Arnold. And majority of things make it through. We had an Aedes homolepis from Japan that, you know, they saw some eggs that were in hatched, unhatched eggs that were in some of the seeds. So these were extracted from the cones. We were happy they incinerated it. You know, it was you can go back and get it, but once the genie's out of the bottle, you know, it's hard to put it back in. And then, you know, those seeds go through trials and error and following recipes to coax them into germination. These are some Quercus virginiana from the northernmost part of its range a few years ago. We're practicing zone denial. We will get live oak to grow in Boston. And yeah, a couple of days ago we had Little Women being filmed. That's more likely than a recreation of Gone with the Wind, I can guarantee that. But you know, here are those plants. We've got Quercus virginiana growing outside, surviving a couple winters. This is just from this summer. I took this picture. This has been in the ground 3 years. It's surviving. So anyway, so these plants get put out in the landscape in, you know, appropriate locations for either where they're going to best grow. In these cases, microclimates. Generally, though, they'll go in their taxonomic sequence, and they start to earn their keep. You know, we're about the research and discovery, and so here we've got Kaya, a member of Team Viburnum, kind of the Yale Brown, well, now all Yale since Erica Edwards went to Yale, teaming up with Mike Donahue, but studying our viburnums in situ, photosynthesis, real-time photosynthesis. Hugh McAllister working on his monograph, the very first comprehensive monograph of birch. Only came out 4 years ago. So he spent 2 sabbatics. He was at the University of Liverpool. 2 summers in a sabbatic at the Arboretum working through our collection. Spent a lot of time here at the herbaria also studying our collection. Served those purposes. You know, to the primary user, I guess. But it also goes to you know, the other primary, you know, primary schools. We're there to teach and to inspire, whether it's some of our Head Start kids or second graders, in this case on the far right, learning about seed dispersal in the fall, or some of our pop-up examples where they're underneath some cercitophyllum, and it's like, what's that smell? If you've never smelled a cercitophyllum, you're in for a treat. But it's like, you know, this amazing spicy cinnamony smell. And so, yeah, working with kids is a really important purpose that these plants serve. And the other aspect is just go for a walk in the woods. Or if you can't walk in the woods, walk in the tree museum. The value of, you know, the restorative value of plants. We know that to be true. And sometimes in society, you know, I front-loaded this talk about the doom and the gloom. Sometimes you just need a little hope. And even on a beautiful winter's day, walking underneath the black locust, gosh, this couple was completely restored, I hope. You know, so I go and I say, you know, is plant exploration dead in this plant bind era? Obviously not. It's not. There's, you know, the Arnold Arboretum is active. So are a plethora of other botanical gardens in Arboretum. Certainly, you know, universities, whether they're traditional botanists or ecologists or global biogeochemists, and they're doing some botanical exploration, even in a non-traditional way. And then certainly there are groups such as the New England Botanical Club that are also doing it. But I do think that we can do a lot better. I think there are things that we not just can do, but we have to. And this is where I kind of make it a little personal. Why the heck am I here? How in the heck did this Indiana farm kid become the keeper at Harvard's Tree Museum, the Arnold Arboretum? And, you know, just going back, you know, I talked about how botanical gardens preserve and share stories about plants. Herbaria preserve and share stories about plants. That's really kind of an unsung, unhighlighted role that we play, that we need to, you know, sing from, you know, the loftiest places. I am here because I learned those plant stories as a kid. You know, picking flowers I wasn't supposed to. I got in a lot of trouble. I would always kick picking flowers. I wasn't supposed to. But anyway, I did it anyway. And I'd get caught. But even, this is me in Halloween. I was dressed, I wanted to be the leaf man. I wanted to go out. We went out and we collected leaves. And we traced them on felt. And then everybody thought I was a pile of leaves. I was actually supposed to be Jack Frost painting the leaves, hence the watercolors. But anyway, I was in the plants. So it's no surprise that I'm here. But one of the things that you know, I learned these plant stories and the value of them. You know, and it's my parents' garden. You know, there were, you know, Rudbeckia laciniata that came from my grandpa, and we didn't call it outhouse plant, or it's got other more colorful names. We called it grandpa's flowers. You know, the Lychnis came from my great-grandparents. These violets were dug up at my grandpa's woods, and we put them in the yard. You know, whether we should have done it or not, it's 20 miles away. You know, whatever. But you learn from that. But yeah, these plants had this value attached to them. You know, when I was a kid, started going up to Fernwood Botanic Garden, which was about 45 minutes from my parents' house. So I saw my first cercitophyllum when I was 12. And fell in love with it. Ended up working there a couple times, you know, out of college before I went off to grad school. I dug up out of their nursery this nasty old katsura that was about ready to die, and planted it. And this is just last year. My mom and the dog Reagan, named after the actor, you know, next to this cercitophyllum. I kind of fell in love with cercitophyllum, and it was like a contagion. You know, I couldn't go anywhere without taking a photo of one, maybe in fall color. Here's actually one at Cornell Plantations, Cornell Botanic Garden. A beautiful one above Zucker Shrub Garden. One down at the Morris Arboretum. Okay, so you get the hint. I've been interested in katsura for a long time. I first went to China in 1999 on a project looking at Cercitophyllum japonicum. I realized when I was looking at this how much gray I haven't looked at this image for a long time until I was putting this talk together. And anyway, so we collected germplasm, seed. None of mine germinated, but thankfully I'd shared it with a couple institutions. The Arnolds didn't germinate, but the Holden Arboretum, their plants germinated. And I was able then to take cuttings off of that and get those rooted and growing. And then here's the plant, finally in 2012, finally flowering for the first time. So I have this long-term relationship with Cercidophyllum that is kind of this long, these stories. An interesting story, though, is that Wilson in 1910, when he was up near Pingwu, photographed this tree. This is actually the type specimen, or the tree from which the type specimen came from of Cercidophyllum sinense, or Cercidophyllum japonicum var sinense. The tree is still alive. And last year, we visited it. The tree is 5 times the height. The woods has grown up. This was completely dropped for timber and for grazing. There was not a tree around Wilson noted. Now it's all trees and all leeches. A lot of leeches that year. And we had to recreate the photo. Andrew's tall. He's 6'4". Anyway, so we almost got it right. We didn't have one to stand next to it to base it off to model it. But anyway, yeah. So I was inspired. All these things inspire me. And actually, most recently, I've done a lot of research, put out a couple papers. One kind of proved, molecular systematics of Cercidophyllum and the separation of these two species. There's one area where they overlap. Cercidophyllum japonicum is native to Japan and China, whereas Cercidophyllum magnificum is native just to high elevations in Honshu. And there's one spot where the elevational gradients overlap, and that's here. And this Cercidophyllum magnificum was about 100 meters away from the Cercidophyllum japonicum. I started growing this species back in 1998, but finally saw it for the first time in the wild just a month ago. And so anyway, why do I bring all that up? Well, I add something here about the role that plant exploration plays, not in just doing all these noble, important things, but inspiring. That we as plant explorers, and I say we, everybody in this room, who's been out on a botanical foray, whether it's near, whether it's far, we're all botanical explorers. And we know that I'm sure if we had workshopped this, we could probably all, within 2 minutes, come up with all of these different roles that we as botanical explorers play. I don't know how much or how long it would take for us to come up with this role that we play, and I think a growing need to inspire others. Inspiring others who aren't in this room to appreciate plants, to do what we can do to put the lenses on these plant-blind people. And it's something. It's something this is something new over the last 6 months to a year that I've thought a lot about at the Arnold, others at other gardens, and I'm really pivoting kind of how I even approach talking about plant exploration. I mean, I think of you're 127, I don't know, 1895? Is that when you were founded?
96.
96? Okay, so you're old. You've been around for a while. You have done a heck of a job exploring the flora of New England. You've got an extremely rich herbarium collection documenting the presence and the absence of our floristic diversity. It's being used directly to embed and empower the conservation of these plants, and then enabling those to study them. It's really important. You should all pat yourselves on the back for over 125 years of success. You've got a beautiful journal, Rhodora, that can help translate and transmit this knowledge. But I'll say one thing and leave you with this. Are you sharing and inspiring? What are you doing to get new people in this room? People who don't even know what botany means. What's the role that the New England Botanical Club, just like the role of the Arnold Arboretum or the Missouri Botanical Garden, you name it. Think about that. You certainly want NEBC to be around for another 125 years. You want to make sure that it's still being able to do its job. I think we're all going to have to think critically about how we're reaching those who don't even realize that plants are valuable. They don't know the value of botany. I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I do know that we need to start asking the question and doing something. Sometimes we're going to get it right, sometimes we might get it wrong. But we really need to think about how we diversify those who can also be contributing to plant conservation and biodiversity studies. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you for your attention. Lots of information, chock-a-block on our website. For those of you who do social media, I do Instagram, a lot about plants, almost all about plants. So if you're on the Instagram, which is what all the kids are on, I guess. But anyway, I'm at Tree Curator for the Instagram, which is basically just photos and some verbiage. But how plants inspire me, sometimes I hope that I can then inspire others. So anyway, thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions now or in the refreshments hall. Thank you. Alice.
It's not a question, but a comment. When Lisa Palmer was comparing the greenhouses at Dartmouth, she had a quote from somebody, and I don't know who it was from, on her door that said, "Biology is the study of plants and their parasites."
Oh, that's great. Biology is the study of plants and their parasites. I love that. Tower Hill Botanical Garden, in the cafeteria or whatever place you eat, they put a big thing, sign up there that says, "Plants are responsible for all the air we breathe and the food we eat." It's that simple. But we know that. I like that. I'm gonna add that. I'm gonna find out. Maybe I'll do a Google search and see if that can be attributed to anybody. It can be attributed to Anand. He or she's done a lot. Any other questions? Thoughts? Commentary? Yes, sir.
Years ago, in my history with NEBC, Dr. Who led us on a nice walk through the Arnold Arboretum. I led the club on a field trip there. That was very inspiring for me. I'm curious, she went back to China. Do you know anything about
Judy of
Dr. Who?
Yeah, I mean, she passed away a few years ago at 102, is that?
Something like that, yeah.
Well, exactly. There's a controversy on which the age. But yeah, she went back to Hong Kong, was there for a while. She still has family in the area, so she would come back every few years. I actually met her in 2002, 2001 when she visited. And so
she was working
a portion of her ashes are actually interned at the Arnold Arboretum. Shh, don't tell anybody. But there's actually even a stone there. So we had a nice ceremony, and they're beneath some ilex fargesii. She did a lot of work with Hemerocallis, a lot of work with ilex, and so underneath some ilex fargesii, we've got a nice stone with her name on it, some information, and a little extra phosphorus.
She was working on a large publication, I believe, when she went over there. You know, I don't think it was anything as monumental as the flora of China, but it was something major that I don't know if she ever.
She did a lot of work on economic botany, and the herbarium there in Hong Kong is named, University of Hong Kong is named after her. You know, she was doing a lot of work with also the kind of the quasi in cultivation plants, kind of the escapees a little bit, and I know a lot of medicinal plants. We just had we have a relationship with the Chinese Union of Botanical Gardens, and we have an exchange program, and we've had 2 students come over, professionals, and the first one was actually really interested in Dr. Who's correspondence, and most of which was in Chinese, and so she was been busy translating that, and so there's a whole wealth of stories there that maybe in a few years we'll be able to tell. Jess?
There was an interesting anecdote you gave at the beginning about the experiment showing kids, I guess, sort of a field of plants and there's a jaguar in the middle. And it's raised a question for me about the issue of plant blindness and whether that's some modern problem or whether that's just an innate feature of human biology, that we're fascinated by large animals.
Or we're afraid of them. I mean, think about it. I mean, look, When I was in Japan a month ago, who's the only person to see the 3 times we saw mamushi? The Gloides blumhoffii. It's like a copperhead, only it's there. Me, because I have a huge snake phobia. Everyone's out like looking at the plants and looking at the seeds. I'm like looking up and like, there's one right there. So yeah, I mean, survival. I mean, I really do think it's not just that, oh, the animal's cute and it moves and it attracts our attention. It's like sometimes I think there's something back in there that says, hey, be wary of what might eat you.
Yeah, I think little kids have an innate fascination for zoos and
Sure.
animals and stuffed animals. They don't have that same attraction
Yeah,
to plants, and so it's more of a learned thing.
I can see your eyes.
Yeah.
I can see the similarity in your face that to an animal. So there is
it's
something in our biology, definitely.
So we're sort of fighting against that, and then constantly,
Yeah.
it's a cultural transmission to be interested and fascinated in plants.
Right.
Whereas the animal side of the equation is very easy because it's
Yeah.
innate.
Yeah, I think millennia ago we knew our life survived. We knew our survival was based on plants, so we saw them. Now we don't care. We just go to the grocery store, right? We just go to Cambridge Common. You don't need to grow it. You don't need to know a plant. It comes out of a can, or it comes out of the freezer. So I think that there's probably a couple things going on.
That's what I was going
Oh.
to say, is that we used to have I think more people had a closer connection with growing our own food. And that was sort of revived
Yeah.
at different points. So even our older siblings and parents had victory gardens in World War
Mhm.
II. We lived in conditions that weren't as crowded, and we had a closer connection with our medicines coming from plants,
Right.
whereas we don't now. The first trip that I took to Jamaica collecting plants was with a friend from high school, and his father and all the other men in the group who were traveling were all physicians, and I had my plant press, and they said, I remember when I took my plant class, and now our students all think they're going to be doctors, and they don't think they need to know anything about plants.
Right.
At UNH anyway, the people
Yeah.
who are taking systematic botany, or they think they're going to go to medical school, and they don't
Right.
think they need to know anything about plants.
Eventually they'll learn that they're not going to get into that.
They think plants are really cool.
Sorry. Yeah. But no, it's true, and
Yeah.
I think it's true that we've got to crack that nugget. We got to figure out, and I will say, I'm just as guilty as others of talking about those millennials, the other. We're all about tribalism. We all have our own tribes. We all need to think. Our membership of the Arnold Arboretum aren't too many millennials. Probably not too many millennials that are member of the NEBC either. And so I think, occasionally, but I think that we really do need to think about all the generations. I think that how we can stretch our minds and make ourselves appeal, or what, how do we make plants appeal to us?
And part of it is where students perceive that they're going to be able to gain income. What
Right.
field, what is a lucrative
Right.
field of study.
Some people not, many universities, certainly people are motivated by income, but I think there's a movement where people are seeking authenticity. Younger generation are seeking something authentic. And I think there's something, where things come from, the backstory, even marketing. I mean, people have, the whole North campaign, it's a clothing that comes out of Minnesota, and it's like celebrating how cold it gets up there. There's a certain level of authenticity, and I think that maybe there's some nugget there where we can talk about the authenticity of the plants that provide our food, our fiber, and around us. As people become interested in, whether it's slow food, localvorism, or just being connected to something. I don't know. I don't have answers. There's a question.
I can say something for millennials,
Please.
kind of. So I am part of a group of postdocs that put together Plant Love Stories, which is a social media project to bring together stories about plants that people love, and it's not just, it's all conservation biology postdocs that put it together, but it's not just ecologists and botanists who are writing the Plant Love Stories. We're trying to collect them from a variety of people, and a lot of the stories hinge on family relationships.
Yeah.
There's a lot of grandparents, and so
Yeah.
your story about your grandfather's flower, that is, like, that story exists
Exactly.
for so many people. And so if any of you would like to contribute a plant love story, I brought stickers.
Oh, I mean, but that is a novel idea. And how many, I mean,
It's online at plantlovestories.com.
Plant Love Stories by .com.
This is Caitlin, our March speaker.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I mean, it really is. And also thinking about, you know, there are a bunch of hands raised about gardeners. If you grow plants, you know that they tend to reproduce, and sometimes those herbaceous, you get a little bit more. Giving plants to somebody, you know, as a recognition of the friendship, but also you're passing along a little, you know, give a plant to somebody who's not a gardener. Force them to become one. Because, you know, they might be motivated because of their connection to you. Their connection, whether you're a relative or a friend or something like that. But, you know, I think that everybody in this room, we kind of have a moral obligation to ensure that our plants are going to be around there for the next generations, and they're going to be people like us who are going to be celebrating.
Thank you for the challenge.
Yeah.
And we accept. It was wonderful. Just an update, the council was talking tonight a little bit about this, releasing some more money for undergraduate students. And this marvelous idea I want to get into a little more with you next door is just presenting, putting together a vector for teachers or different groups to solicit somebody to come speak to them. So a grandchild or a child's classroom that needs a science topic, come and talk about ecology or plants.
Yeah,
we're
fantastic.
We're getting there.
That's great. That's great. Just in a second, I mean, I know some people have some driving to do and things like that. I'm happy, George and Nancy, if you want to talk maybe in the refreshment room. Is that okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, we can we can release some folks. Okay.
You know, as a tour guide at the Arboretum, we constantly are, you know, encouraging people to learn how to change, you know, learn about plants identification and comparing maples. And you've got a tremendous school program.
Yes.
That you have one photo of that.
Yes.
You're doing a lot.
We do a lot. We're able to reach those who show up. The reason there are underserved audiences is because they're underserved. And I think that we're only reaching the people who come into the gate in Jamaica Plain. You know, we're not reaching those who don't know we exist or can't get there. And I think working in schools, you know, we have a very effective train-the-trainer program, a summer workshop where we fund for free, you know, 25 elementary school teachers in Boston Public School who are teaching science, and guess what? They didn't take science in college. And so, you know, having great faculty, Elena Kramer gives a wonderful lecture, Professor Chair OEB here, a bunch of others, we're all chip in, and that way, you know, training the teachers. And they love it when we come into the classroom as professionals. You can be an expert by vocation or avocation. And so if you have that opportunity to get into some of these classrooms, I think they would relish the opportunity. And I think you'd probably get a lot out of it too as an individual.
Did everybody sign in?
Yes.
I just wanted to
George,
say,
yeah.
if you watch the really good shows on TV, they're almost 95% or 98% on animals. And that's like the Blue Planet,
Yeah.
David Attenborough, Nova, Nature, all the good shows on National Geographic, very few on plants.
Exactly. I don't even think they have the Victory Garden anymore.
No.
Yeah. No, it's true. It is true.
It's sometimes if you go for a hike with a hiker or a botanist, they're radically different. Hikers don't really see anything, they just go.
They just go.
And so maybe the secret is teaching people to learn to look.
Yes. Yeah. Stop and smell the roses. Isn't that what they say?
Something like that.
Yeah.
You can't see the forest for the trees.
All that kind of stuff. But no, I think if we all pause and take the time to observe, we start to, you know, relax, learn. Well, anyway.
What do we know?
Well, thank you for the invitation to come. And,